Hi, and welcome to Vlogs of History, Episode 2. I'm your host, Darius Cosden, and today we go back to the year 1920, the Prohibition. Good old alcohol. The only thing that makes life bearable, isn't it? Well, in the 1920s, if you were caught drinking alcohol, you could have maybe went to jail for it. That's right, that's the Prohibition, and that's today's topic. So let's get to it. The Prohibition was a nationwide constitutional ban on the sale, production, and transportation of alcohol. It was legislated under the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, and the only reason that it came into existence was the fact that people were drinking too much, partying too much, gambling too much, and they thought that if they banned alcohol, well, people would stop doing these bad things and it would eventually lead to a better society. The Prohibition lasted from 1920 to 1933. That's 13 years. Can you imagine alcohol being illegal in the United States for 13 years? How does that happen? Although personal consumption and possession was not illegal under the federal law, many states imposed their own laws, eventually making it illegal. Not to worry though, even though it was still illegal to drink alcohol, people still drank. If people want to drink, they'll drink. You can't really stop people from getting alcohol, especially in the United States. Interestingly enough, before the Prohibition went into effect, the rich and the upper class, and generally those who could afford it, they stockpiled alcohol for their own personal at-home consumption. They emptied the inventories of liquor retailers and just took everything for themselves. This, of course, pissed people off. It pissed off the people who, well, couldn't afford to buy all this alcohol. You had the poor who just couldn't drink, and you had employees who were pissed off at their employers because their employers had enough money to get alcohol for themselves, and the poor could not. And this was one of the main reasons why the Prohibition ultimately failed, because it wasn't fair and eventually people became unhappy with it. Although the original purpose of the Prohibition was to make a better society, what actually ended up happening was the opposite. Banning alcohol gave rise to a huge underground market for alcohol. It created bootleggers and bootlegging, which is essentially smuggling in alcohol when it's illegal, and it also gave rise to speakeasies. Now, speakeasies were essentially just bars and clubs where people would go there to drink alcohol under the Prohibition. They were usually run by organized crime, and even though the cops often raided them, arrested their owners, and shut them down, speakeasies in general flourished because the industry was just so profitable. Everybody wanted alcohol. In fact, by 1925 alone, in New York City, there was an estimated 30,000 to 100,000 speakeasies on the island. Speaking of cops, that was the main problem of the Prohibition and why it failed. Basically, there just wasn't enough enforcement to actually enforce the banning of alcohol. If you're gonna make a law that prohibits something, well, you better have enough resources to actually enforce that law. And they didn't. And even if they did, not everybody was for the Prohibition. Famous bootlegger George Cassidy came forward and said how he had bootlegged for Congress for 10 years. Even Warren G. Harding, the 29th President of the United States, moved his whole alcohol supply in the White House when he took office in 1921. You had some people that were for the Prohibition and you had some people that were against the Prohibition. Those for the Prohibition were called the Dries, and they were part of the Dry movement, which was essentially to create a better society by banning alcohol. Those who were against the Prohibition were called the Wets. In the beginning, you had a lot more Dries than you had Wets, but as the Prohibition went along, well, people started hating the Prohibition. There was a lot more crime. It wasn't fair. Some people were getting alcohol while the other people could not, often the poor, and they weren't happy. So that's when Franklin Roosevelt came into play. He was running for president and he saw that people starting to want alcohol back, and he used this to his advantage. He promised people that if he got elected, well, he would end the Prohibition. And he did. He got elected, and then in 1933 he officially ended the Prohibition, which was also perfect timing because the Great Depression had just hit and there was a huge loss of jobs. And bringing back alcohol would bring back jobs, and more importantly, would bring back the taxes imposed on alcohol and bringing in extra government revenue. Alright, so that was it for episode 2 of Vlogs of History. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe to be notified when episode 3 comes out. If you haven't seen it already, make sure to check out episode 1, which I will link right here. We talked about World War II. It's a very interesting video. There's a lot of interesting content. As always, I'm your host, Darius Cosden. It's been a pleasure, and I'll see you next Monday.